This is the Sideways Thinker podcast with me, Caroline Kay. In this series, we're going to explore some of our best known or even least known Bible stories, helping us reconnect to the West's most important foundational texts. Whether you're a seasoned Bible reader or simply Bible curious, join me to rediscover this outrageous literary collection. As Westerners, it is the air that we breathe and the ground upon which we walk, because these are the stories that literally built the West. They have nurtured, amazed, and sustained us. They have brought us right up to this moment, right here, right now. Welcome to Babel for the Bible curious. Welcome back to our series on the Tower of Babel. This is episode 4. In episode 1, we thought about the matter of everybody speaking, and that language is something we inhabit rather than a tool to pick up, use and discard. We also talked about the Bible being more about meaning and wisdom rather than facts. I recommended Peter Enns' book, How the Bible Actually Works. And in episode 2 and 3, we discussed further how language is more than just communication. It's about a shared culture. Because we have language, we can understand concepts such as past, present, and future. We acknowledge that belief in God might not be easy for some people, and that it's possible to see God as a character in the story. We also thought about the Bible being developed out of a performative experience and a listening experience, and this chimes with the book recommendation across the 2 episodes, Hugh Wilborn's Bug in Our Thinking. And in this episode, we segue from language into the idea of uniformity imposed from a position of power. Uniform language rarely happens naturally. Language tends to be dynamic and changeable over time. Uniformity with language usually comes from a position of power. From Nimrod to modern empires, language is one of the oldest tools of control. Remember what it said. Everyone had one language and spoke the same words. In this episode, we will turn our attention to the city. If you recall, the text in verse 4 says, "Come, let us build a city and a tower." So it's not the tower that the unnamed people build first. It's the city. The tower is never completed. They want to make a name for themselves. And of course, the only name they acquire for themselves is confusion and obscurity. And they can be seen to play God in a number of ways. They replace the natural world with their own structures, bricks, bitumen, and the tower instead of stone, mortar, or a natural mountain, a mountain being the structure where traditionally people have encountered God. Biblical scholar Christine Hayes writes about the Bible's hostility to Babylon and its imperialism, and she points to the word Babilim, which means gate of the god in Akkadian, which works as a mocking pun in the Hebrew. In terms of wordplay, Bab Elim, gate of God or gate of the gods, the Babel story subverts the idea of Babylon's own understanding of itself through parody. Elim itself actually is the plural of the word gods, but it's used in the generic sense. It doesn't actually refer to God. If you substitute one letter in Babel, you will get Balal, meaning confusion. And she cites Nahum Sana, who sees the story as being about defiance of God's command to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, because they, this unnamed people, want to congregate in just one place. So a reminder of some of that wordplay in the original Hebrew. Key Hebrew terms, Babel was how we would pronounce it, and Balal. So the words, they look almost identical. If you don't look too hard, you can see that they each have a repeated consonant And that, again, that also suggests this idea of repetition, this sort of constant repeated rhythm that is present in the text. So you have this Babel, and you have Balal, to confuse, to mix, or to jumble. Therefore, its name was called Babel, or Bavel, because there the Lord, Balal, the language of the earth. God mixed the languages of the earth. So the call to action begins with the statement, "Come, let us build." First it's bricks, that's the technology, and then it's a city. They want to build and they want fame, they want renown. Now, we'll come back to the technology aspect in another episode, but for now, let's concentrate on this idea of the city and this element of fame. Fame is something that brings power. We know that in the modern time. If somebody is well known and renowned, then they seem to have a power because they're well known and people like them, and so on. So the people who are unnamed in the Babel story, they want their collective prowess in their construction of this tower and the city recognised in this man-made monument that will reach the heavens. And of course, in those days, the idea of the heavens was what they could see above them. At the time of this story's inception, people didn't see the world as a round, spherical structure. They thought of it as flat with a dome and all the rest of it. So they saw the idea of the tower reaching the clouds as being something that would allow a connection between the earth and heaven. So they want to be well known. They want this monument to be something that celebrates them and their abilities and their ability to overcome the natural world. They fantasize, if you like, about the sense of wonder and admiration that will be received as a result of their endeavors. When people see this amazing tower, people will be impressed and the glory will be on them. And so there's an interesting connection that we can make already. Who in the Bible was the first person to build a city? And of course, it's Cain. And he does this after he kills his brother Abel. You can make this connection, this particular kind of civilization. It's not that civilization is wrong, far from it. But if you have a civilization that operates in a certain way, then it's not good. So you have this killing of Abel. Cain settles in a land, he builds a city, he names it after his son, and becomes the ancestor of technological and cultural innovators, which is really interesting because you can see the connection with Babel, the idea of settling in one place, building a city, and the idea of naming it. So the people of Babel want to get a name for themselves through their monumental building. And of course, this follows on from a mindset that has been set in motion by Cain, the first person to kill somebody. So the text is really compressed, obviously. There's only 9 verses, but it isn't accidental that the first city builder is Cain. And we'll just allude to this because it is something that we will come back to. And that Abel, who's killed by Cain, is a shepherd. And there is a recurring image of the shepherd throughout the Bible in both the Old Testament and, of course, the New. And this is going to be an important signifier for something very deep that the Bible alludes to. And again, it's this idea that making the connections across the biblical corpus becomes really important, and this is rarely done. It's certainly rarely done in religious circles. Jordan Peterson sees Cain as the archetypal figure of resentment. Cain offers his sacrifice, but his offering is rejected, whilst Abel's is accepted. Instead of responding with self-examination and repentance and a determination to do better next time, Cain turns towards bitterness, envy, and ultimately murder. For Peterson, this psychological turn is closely related to what later Christian tradition associates with the figure of Lucifer: pride, resentment towards a higher good, refusal to accept one's own proper place, rebellion against the structure of reality, and a desire to destroy what one cannot equal. And there is an interesting connection to Babel here. What's particularly interesting is that Peterson sees a progression. Firstly, Cain, where resentment corrupts the individual. Secondly, the flood generation, where corruption spreads through society. And then thirdly, Babel, pride and overconfidence become collective and institutional. You might even say, baked into those bricks. In that sense, Cain is the seed of the same impulse that culminates in Babel. The individual says, I reject the order of reality. And then the city eventually says, we reject the order of reality. For Peterson, Lucifer, Cain, and Babel are therefore manifestations of a single recurring pattern: the refusal to accept the limits of creaturely existence, coupled with the desire to remake the world according to one's own will. And this remaking according to one's own will is what I refer to as a top-down framework, rather than a ground-up or grounded framework, another idea we shall return to. Either you acknowledge the real world into which you must find your place and fit in with, or you want to shape reality according to your own desires, a clear form of idolatry. Returning to Cain, in rabbinic and literary readings, Cain is often the figure who cannot live with difference. He cannot tolerate Abel's favour. He doesn't see that you need to make a necessary sacrifice, that you have to do the work. Additionally, he fails to see that he can still work at it. He doesn't want to work at it. He just wants to destroy the reminder of his own failure, his more successful brother. Babel then becomes a collective version of the same problem. Humanity cannot tolerate plurality and seeks a single name, a single language, a single project, and therefore one way of thinking. This is a kind of totalizing, not what we mean by totalitarian thinking, and that line of thought links Cain and Babel directly. One could argue that the deeper biblical theme is not rebellion against hierarchy, but hostility towards difference of thought. So I've mentioned before the situating of the story, coming after the Noah story and appearing before Abraham comes onto the scene. And an interesting aspect of this can be seen in the lead up to the Babel story as we leave Noah. And it's the mentioning of Nimrod. And Nimrod is a big clue as to the idea of how oppressive the Babel regime is. And I suppose if you've been following me up to now, you may have thought, well, you're making quite a lot of claims here about this totalitarian regime. How do we know that it's as bad as that? And this is your big clue. So if we look at the lead up, as we leave Noah and we leave that story behind, we then move on to a passage which is quite typical in some ways in the Bible, where you start getting a bit of a genealogy, so-and-so begat so-and-so. And many people switch off from those things because they're not particularly interesting on the face of it. But we've got something really interesting here, because we've got the descendants of Noah, and we have Shem, which means name. So we know that because we've heard all of those plays on words, Shem, Sham, and so on in the Babel story. Ham and Japheth. And these are the children born after the flood. So we've got this post-flood setup here. And then we've got some further names mentioned, and we get told that the descendants of Javan, Elisha, and Tarshish. So one of the names that comes up is Tarshish. And we find that Tarshish is a significant place when we get to the Jonah story. So there's a link, fast-forwarding much further on into the Old Testament, of the story of Jonah. So we're not going to go into that story, but it's just worth mentioning because Tarshish is the place that Jonah wants to escape to rather than going to where God wants him to go to, at Nineveh. And of course, Nineveh is known to be a very corrupt and very violent place. And what do you get here? So we learn more about the descendants. We've got Ham, Cush, and Egypt. I'm trying not to read absolutely everything here because I want to get to the point where we've got this name Cush, who is the father of Nimrod. And it says, he was the first on earth to become a mighty warrior. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. And then we get Erech, Akkad, all of them in the land of Shinar. And this, of course, relates directly to what's coming in the story of Babel. But most people wouldn't necessarily pick up on that. But that's a really massive clue as to what we're going to get when we get to the Tower of Babel. So that's one of the underpinnings of my claim, that this is basically a totalitarian society. It's an evil society because we've got this tyrant figure of Nimrod, who we have to assume is the starting point for this totalizing one way of thinking, one language, one set of words, one way of thinking, uniformity, identical bricks, and the replacement of the natural world with man-made replacements. So there's a real symbolic thing there where humankind is replacing God's world with its own world and building a monument to itself. So you can see, as you piece together these various clues, that what we have with the Tower of Babel is not just people who want to work together to reach God. There's something much darker going on there that needs mentioning. And so that lead up, that positioning of the story after Noah and before we get to Abraham, very significant person in terms of the history of the Israelite nation and thus what follows on the Christian religion and so on. So we've got this really interesting positioning, which is relevant. Nimrod is a relevant figure. One of the points to notice as well is that where the others just get their names mentioned here in the lead up to the Tower of Babel story, Nimrod gets a few verses. It's underlined. He's a warrior before the Lord, and therefore people said he has a reputation. So people would refer to Nimrod. So Nimrod is a significant player in all of this, and obviously was renowned. Dare I say it, he had made a name for himself, and that's a clue as well as to what's going on. But what happens with the idea of empires, this sort of Nimrodian empire that's in the making here, is that you have this standardization of language. This happens. Language becomes flattened into the dominant order's mainstream. So this is something that scholars have identified throughout history. Language becomes flattened. Everyone has the same language and ends up speaking the same words. And so in the story of Babel, we've got this image of the bricks. People become like the bricks. They become homogenized. They become similar, where God appears to want difference. He wants diversity of thought. He wants people to be able to argue. There seems to be a kind of requirement on God's part for people to work out and realize that they need to pay attention to his order, the wonderful gifts that he's given, but also that they have freedom. And that freedom of choice, if you like, that freedom of conscience only comes about when you have difference. Because if everybody's just forced into the same thing, you are never making a choice based on difference, based on two different options or three different options. If you only have one way presented to you, there is no possibility of being able to make a choice that's different. How could you do that? So it could be argued that empire is characterized by this sort of centralized authority. And although Nimrod isn't mentioned in the actual Tower of Babel story, he's given quite a lead up as we get to that story. So empire characterized by this centralized authority, universal rule, cultural homogenization, coercive unity, not just unity in a nice self-initiated collective, but a coercive unity and a suppression of national distinction. That's actually quite important when we think of the wider world and the ongoing historical developments. Because we are seeing a bit of an attack on the idea of the nation. What we're seeing is a desire to break down borders, to flatten the idea of different national ways of being, different national characteristics. There's a lot of sneering and disapproval of national flags and a fear of a certain kind of nationalism. There are different kinds of nationalisms, I would say. But these are the characteristics that are almost on the table here as we put together all of the different connections, as we work towards a fuller understanding of the Tower of Babel story, as we put all of these things together and all of these connections together, we start to see a bigger picture. So we've come across this idea before that if you control speech, you shape reality. And it is an important part of things. If you're ruling over people and you want to shape the way they behave and you want to create your great monuments and your great achievements, you're just using the people as if they're tools and bricks and material to use, then controlling people's ability to speak freely, to disagree, that is, a key component of wanting to control people. So if you think in terms of the modern day, and a number of things have been happening over the last 5 or 6 years, but we could make an analogy here that some would agree with, some might not agree with, or some have yet to understand this. But if you think about that call to action, come let us build, bake bricks and build a city and a tower and so on. What if we said, come let us build smart cities with 5th generation towers in the sky in order to make a name for ourselves? I'm kind of being a little bit disingenuous here, perhaps, but these kind of things are happening. We've got a digital infrastructure that's being constructed which will act as a massive surveillance project. We know that there are cameras almost everywhere now. People are monitored in lots of different ways. This is not just happening in Britain, it's happening in different parts of the world, and it is the idea of the Internet of Things where everything is connected to a controlled source. And this isn't actually something that's a conspiracy theory, it's actually something that's well documented in the public domain. So we can actually see that even our own modern lives, you can see patterns that are happening in something like Genesis, even in a 9-verse little story. There's something to learn there that might actually help us to navigate something in our actual lives, in our modern lives. So we will come back to some of the modern allusions as we go along with the series. So in terms of the sort of realist angle, a lot of people will point out that when we think of the Tower of Babel, we think of the Babylonian ziggurat, which is a kind of multi-staged temple. And the Bible makes use of wordplay. We've talked about this before, that the Bible is making use of puns and rhythms in the Hebrew. And so you've got this word Babel, Babelim, and Babylon, all of these word plays. Now, Babylon was always considered to be idolatrous within Hebrew culture. And Babel is the Hebrew translation of Babylon. And of course, the Mesopotamians pronounced it Bab-elim. And so this is the Akkadian language, which means gate of the god. And so you've got then an understanding from people hearing this story in ancient times. People would get the point that this is a pagan, idolatrous construction. Okay, so people would get the idea that this is constructed with these aims in mind to worship pagan gods. And so it's the wordplay, this gate of the god, then becomes transformed into the idea of meaningless babble, incomprehensible speech. So the tower could form one of many monuments that rulers like to see created in their name. So this links again to the idea of empire building. So the idea of a grand heavenly tower will form an impressive and powerful spectacle for all to see. And it's arguably because in desiring to outdo God, humans construct the tower as man's own version of a mountain. So in place of a natural mountain, we have a man-made imitation of a mountain, born of human hard labour and suffering. We could even cite a modern rock song, Another Brick in the Wall. So it might be interesting or helpful just to think back about the structure of the Bible, or the way the Bible operates. Because a lot of people have assumed, really possibly because they haven't engaged with it, or because of the way some religious education has put things over, that There's a lot of assumptions about how the Bible operates, and I think it's fair to say that the Bible does allude to the importance of diversity. So it's probably fair to say that there isn't a singular worldview presented in the Bible. That might contradict what some people imagine is the case, but I think it's a fair remark. And I'm citing a biblical scholar when I use the phrase, and it is an artful compendium of ideas. So notwithstanding that my own mother tongue, the English language, is used internationally, it's in another language altogether that forms our new modern Babel cities and prison towers. So even though my own mother tongue, the English language, is used internationally, we're not all required to speak only the English language and use only one set of words. But we've got a different kind of common language that everybody is using, and we could talk about that as being binary code or the language of the computer. So it's a bit like those Babylonian bricks. It cajoles us into narrow pathways of thought. People feel corralled into one way of thinking quite a lot of the time. And we talk about it being social media. We could even say anti-social media in this case. Like the artificial mountain tower, we could actually make a point about artificial intelligence. It's not really intelligent. It's a tool, if you like. There is nothing behind the curtain. There is no grounding. There is no earth. This artificial intelligence, this binary code, it's calculative. It literally is calculative, algorithmic formulae. Returning to Jordan Peterson's thoughts about the Babel story, one of his more interesting points is that the Babel story shows both the greatness and danger of human cooperation. Of course, we have to work together with things, but we have to find a balance. Human beings can achieve extraordinary things when they unite around a common goal, and civilization itself does depend on that capacity. But when cooperation is detached from the truth, we can find ourselves immersed in tyranny, and the same ability that builds cities can also build systems of oppression. The greater the coordination, the greater the potential catastrophe when the underlying vision is flawed. So what kind of world grows from that kind of cooperation? If everyone is the same, then everyone is nameless, anonymous, and disappears. This is what happens in the collective mentality. Modern technocratic systems also push humans into anonymity and disappearance. Digital architecture is being built all around us and is a feature of this mindset. The ultimate goal of all of this digital architecture is control of absolutely everything, all the resources on the earth and all the people on the earth. And this is something to think about. It's probably fair to say that the Tower of Babel is something that has clearly been warning us in each generation about the prospect of tyranny when the collective mindset goes too far. We've seen totalitarian systems emerge and disappear, re-emerge and disappear. And we need to be mindful of that. And so one of the things I think is quite telling is that if you only see God as a character in the story, then you can see God in this instance as being wary of the city, wary of people sort of disappearing into anonymity, wary of people being crushed by a ruler such as Nimrod. And so this is what makes God such an extraordinary character, if that's all you see him as. Of course, the religious don't just see him as a character, they see him as a fundamental part of our existence. But wherever you stand on that spectrum, it's probably fair to say that the Tower of Babel is teaching us a great deal about how we should find balance in the way we organise our societies. So I've kind of talked a little bit about Jordan Peterson in this episode, and I probably mentioned Yoram Hazony. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about that in terms of what the Bible seems to be saying. So first of all, the Jordan Peterson book is We Who Wrestle with God. which is a really interesting book, and it has a whole chapter on the Babel story. And the other book that I would flag up for our discussion is The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture by Yoram Hazony. And he actually explains a little bit in that book about how the Bible sort of brings forth a vision of how to live. And so where you've got this empire where people are, homogenized, and it's a kind of flattening, this centralized authority and suppression of national distinction. And of course, the Bible thinks of Israel as a nation comprising of a people bound by a covenant. So this is actually quite an important way of understanding what a nation is. It's not a racial thing. It's not just about land. It's something more ambiguous or nuanced than that. But land is important. Abraham is called out of Mesopotamia into a particular land, becomes part of a particular family, and embraces and champions a particular covenant. And so the political form that leads out of that is a nation, which is defined by a shared history, shared law, and shared tradition. And so the nation is bound by covenant rather than coercion. And so this becomes the foundation for Hazony's own political writings and his explanation of why being a nationalist in that biblical sense is actually a moral requirement rather than something that is to be stamped on and got rid of. In the next episode, we're going to take a closer look at the issue of technology. We haven't really explored that in any depth yet. We've alluded to it, we've mentioned a few aspects about it, but there's a lot more to it as we piece together the various elements that we've discussed so far, the various aspects of the tower, the bricks, the Nimrod connection, the homogenization, the city, all of these different things. As we start to pull the threads together, hopefully we will see a rather rich tapestry unfolding in front of us, and we get to understand this story far more deeply than we would have done with a simple cursory reading. So until then, goodbye for now. Thank you so much for listening. This has been the Sideways Thinker podcast with the Babel series for the Bible curious, written and produced by me, Caroline Kay. Music is Stars and Laurels by Shane Ivers for Silverman Sounds. If you enjoyed this podcast, and I really hope you did, please like and subscribe and share on the usual platforms. Thank you so much.